Okay. All right, and here. Just, hmm? Okay, let me go back to the. So here is chapter 30, and we are doing verses 8 and 9. So let me go ahead and start that. Text 8. So, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskrityam. Narayanam Namaskrityam Namaskrityam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudire Shanvatam Swakata Krishna Punya Shravana Kirtana Hridayantoste Abhadrani Vidunoti Sahasratam Nashtaprayeshu Abhadreshu Nityam Darevchu Nashtaprayeshu Abhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhakti Bhavati Nashtaki. I'm just getting feedback on my own headset. That's why I'm kind of pausing in between. So thank you so much. So Srimad Bhagavatam 3.30.8. Akshipat mandreyana strinam asitanam chamayaya rahochati shishunam kalabhashinam. Synonym: akshipta, charmed; atma, heart; indriya, his senses; strinam, of women; asatrinam, false; cha, and maya, my maya; rata, in a solitary place; rachitaya, displayed; alapai, by the talking; shishunam, of the children; kala bhashinam, with sweet words. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. He gives heart and senses to a woman who falsely charms him with Maya. He enjoys solitary embraces and talking with her, and he is enchanted by the sweet words of the small children. Purport: family life within the kingdom of illusory energy Maya is just like a prison for the eternal living entity. In prison, a prisoner is shackled by iron chains and iron bars. Similarly, a conditioned soul is shackled by the charming beauty of a woman, by her solitary embraces and talks of so-called love, and by the sweet words of his small children. Thus, he forgets his real identity. In this verse, the words Srinam, Asitanam indicate that womanly love is just to agitate the mind of man. Actually, in the material world, there is no love. Both the woman and the man are interested in their sense gratification. For sense gratification, a woman creates an illusory love, and the man becomes enchanted by such false love and forgets his real duty. When there are children as the result of such a combination, the next attraction is to the sweet words of the children. The love of the woman at home and the talk of the children make one a secure prisoner, and thus he cannot leave his home. Such a person is termed in Vedic language a Grihamedi, which means one whose center of attraction is home. Grihastha refers to one who lives with family, wife, and children, but whose real purpose of living is to develop Krishna consciousness. One is therefore advised to become a Grihastha and not a Grihamedi. The Grihastha's concern is to get out of the family life created by illusion and enter into real family life with Krishna. Whereas the Grihamedi's business is to repeatedly chain himself to the so-called family life in one life after another and perpetually remain in the darkness of Maya. Next verse 9. Griheshu kutadharmeshu dukkha tantra swandrate kurvan dukkha pratikaram sukhavan manyate grihi. Translation: the attached householder remains in his family life, which is full of diplomacy and politics, always spreading miseries and controlled by acts of sense gratification. He acts just to counteract the reaction of all these miseries. And if he can successfully counteract such miseries, he thinks that he is happy. Purport: in Bhagavad Gita, the personality of Godhead himself certifies the material world as an impermanent place that is full of miseries. There is no question of happiness in this material world, either individually or in terms of family, society, or country. If something is going on in the name of happiness, that is also illusion. Here in this material world, happiness means successful counteraction to the effects of distress. The material world is so made that unless one becomes a clever diplomat, his life will be a failure. Not to speak of human society, even the society of lower animals, the birds and bees, clearly manages its bodily demands of eating, sleeping, and mating. Human society competes nationally or individually, and in the attempt to be successful, the entire human society becomes full of diplomacy. We should always remember that in spite of all diplomacy and all intelligence in the struggle for our existence, everything will end in a second by the Supreme Will. Therefore, all our attempts to become happy in the material world are simply a delusion offered by Maya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namah. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namini. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashyata Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasati Gaur Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo. Hare Krishna, dear devotees. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to read and recite and explain from the Srimad Bhagavatam verses, which are very important, and especially on this auspicious day of Ekadashi. Please forgive me for any of my shortcomings and any of my misinterpretations while speaking on these verses. So this section is really the section where Kapila Muni is speaking to Mother Devahuti regarding this material world. You know what? So in the first 5 verses, we saw that the explanation was given regarding the time factor, how the time factor can be very devastating and all of that, and really understanding how it works in this world. And now these verses up until the 16 is really speaking about material world. So what happens is in Srimad Bhagavatam, as you can see, that there is a lot of this section that gives us the attraction to Krishna. A lot of it is really focused on attraction to Krishna and how do we develop our bhakti and really how do we get there, right? But there are certain sections of Srimad Bhagavatam which are also focused towards the reality of this material world. And that is really supposed to create some aversion for us towards this material world, when we really understand what is this material world, we should really tend to get that aversion just so we can focus towards the spiritual world and develop more and more attraction towards Krishna. So that's the whole goal. But we also have to understand that we cannot also become too much aversion. We can't have so much aversion that we also become impersonalists. So that's not the goal, okay? But really taking it from the real perspective, understanding what this material world is, and then moving on towards the spiritual path. So this verses 8 and 9 is really focusing on the relationship of how this human entity, like when human, even the other beings too, when we come into this material world, what's the relationship, what's the foundation, right, with this material world? So in verse 8 it talks about when the person gives their heart to the senses to a woman and falsely charms with Maya. So even if these verses are focused towards like the masculine gender, we have to understand that this also applies to the feminine, right? It applies to both. But basically what happens is there is just so much attraction to the opposite sex, and then it's really what happens is you get deluded completely and then thinks that that's all it is in this world, right? And see here, Prabhupada also focuses that it indicates that womanly love is just to agitate the mind of a man and vice versa. So in this world, there is no love. And we know that it is completely a true perverted reflection of what is in the spiritual world. So here, what happens is now when we get attracted, it completely takes us away from the attraction towards Krishna. And we learned about the Avarnatmika Shakti and Prakshepatmika Shakti. It is like the first one. What happens is when you come into the material world, we are completely in darkness. Somebody gave this analogy. It is like almost going to a movie theater and watching a movie, right? So the first thing what happens is all the lights are turned dark, right? When you walk into a movie theater, everything is dark. It is like you don't see any light. So that's the first Shakti where we completely have all darkness. We don't remember anything, who we are, our eternal identity. And then the second aspect, Prakshepatmika, is like then you just totally you enter into the movie, then you start watching the movie and you identify yourself with all those characters. And if you're really focused on the movie, you feel that you're really a character of the movie and you start feeling those emotions. You identify completely with the full story. Similarly, we come into this material world, everything is dark, like we forget who we are. And then, secondly, we identify ourselves with this material world, our family, our jobs, our position, our everything around us. And no matter what life we have, we completely get identified with everything and we live this life. So we forget who we are truly, what our position is, and what our relationship is with our eternal Father. So these verses really are really coming back to that point. And here, if we can see that the love of the woman at home and talk of the children make one a secure prisoner, and thus he cannot leave his home, right? Isn't that so true? Like you get so bound and bound and bound. So here's the thing, right? So when we read these verses, it's not like we cannot live our life or we cannot do our material duties or any of that. This is not the point here at all. We do everything, but as a service to Krishna. I think that's when the switch happens in the consciousness that all these verses are trying to understand how a materialistic lives his life. But when we take up to spiritual practices, when we take up Krishna consciousness, then our complete mind, our focus is different, our perception is different, because then our children become the children are also belonging to Krishna. Our job belongs to Krishna. Our paycheck, everything that comes in is a part of Krishna's service, right? So everything becomes changed. But here, as I said, the focus is really to understand how a materialistic lives his life. And when we understand this, we are able to focus more and more to understand, discriminate, and move towards the true spiritual value of life. And in the next verse again, it talks about the happiness. What is true happiness, right? Like there is no true happiness in this world, in this material world. So how much ever we may be focusing, we are really not going to get the real thing, because our true identity is being the servant of Krishna, and the real love is having that spiritual affection, spiritual love with Krishna. So when we come here, we are constantly seeking for that love, but we are seeking in the wrong place, in the wrong direction. So that's the problem here we have. But the moment we align ourselves with Krishna, with his devotees, and in the spiritual path, automatically you can see that the things completely change for us in our life. So with these are really the focus of this. And as I said, one other important point is that when we read about these verses, it's not something that we can now leave everything. Okay, who's this family? Who's this children? Everything is just this world. We shouldn't wrongly think like that either, because at this point, we are supposed to be doing our duty, everything as a service of Krishna. And slowly, 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 with the maturity when it comes, slowly we are going to have detachment with everything, and slowly our attachment towards Krishna is also going to be increasing. Because if prematurely, if we start to detach, it is going to be very artificial, and we will not be able to even sustain that. It is like the mithya, you're like artificially renouncing everything, but you're really not there. So we have to be very careful that we don't even do that as a prematurely at all. It is also given like an example of taking out of anesthesia from surgery. When somebody is in surgery and given anesthesia, if you prematurely take anesthesia off, the patient is not going to tolerate that. It's going to be very painful. Similarly, we are not there yet. These examples are just giving the reality of the material world, but we have to slowly progress and mature in devotional life, and then slowly we will get to a point where we are able to detach and be completely focused on Krishna. So that's really the gist of these two verses right now. Thank you again so much for giving me this opportunity, and please forgive me again for any of my shortcomings. Thank you so much, devotees. Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much, Mataji, for nice summary.
Hare Krishna.
Hare
Thank
Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Mataji. Thank you. Wonderful summary.
Krishna. Thank you, Mataji.
Thank you. Hare Krishna, Mataji. Thank you for the nice summary.
Thank you. Hare
Thank you,
Krishna. Hari
Mataji.
Bol.
Thank you, Mataji. Hari